tonight, what I thought we would look at is a little bit more practical. So last week we looked at our goal or our purpose in Sunday school, and we'll revise that in a moment about having the gospel central, right, in everything. Now tonight, what we're going to look at is think a little bit more practically about how do you actually write a lesson plan, and where can you find good resources that will help you to write a lesson that is gospel-centered, right? Now, there's a lot more other material that you'll see in the notes that I gave you. I maybe won't cover everything in there, but we'll leave some time at the end for some questions. And so anything you think interesting, you really want to ask, you can ask that then. Otherwise, the notes is quite extensive. You can read it also. Now, if some of you prefer BM or the Chinese, then I think I've given the Chinese and the BM outline to Carrie as well, so you can get it from her. Might make it easier to understand. Okay, now I wanted to just start from where we left off last week, and we were thinking last week about our goals in Sunday school. And we saw our goal is not just daycare, it's not just looking after the kids and so that the adults can concentrate on real church, right? It's not that. And it's not just about having fun so that the kids are happy and they want to come back to church and they want to bring their friends. Now, don't hear me wrong. It's good for Sunday school to be fun, isn't it? There's absolutely no reason that Sunday school has to be boring. Kids learn best when they're having fun, don't they? Right. So we should definitely try to make it as fun as we can, right? But that's not our goal in the end, right? Our goal is bigger than that, right? And it's not just about moral instructions, right? It's not just saying to the children that we want them to be good people, that we want them to listen to their parents and don't lie and steal. Of course, we want the children to be good, but that's not our goal, our ultimate goal. And it's not just Bible stories as well. So we don't just want them to have some understanding of Bible stories, but we want them to get the main story of the Bible. We want them to understand who Jesus is and what he's done for them. Right? And so we saw that what we must do is teach children the gospel. I don't know, can anyone remember what was my summary of the gospel? The gospel is the
good news.
Good news, yeah. That
Christ died.
Christ died as our
Savior.
And what?
And was raised
as our
King.
Right. So it's all about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. He's our Savior and King. He died and he rose again. Right. And we saw that that's what the whole Bible is about, including the Old Testament. And you remember we looked at a few examples like David and Goliath and Noah and the Ark. And we thought about how those stories is pointing forward to who Jesus is and how Jesus would come and save us. So we saw that our goal in Sunday school is we want to explain the gospel clearly to the children. We want them to know who Jesus is. We want them to know what he's done for them, right? So that they will respond and put their faith in Jesus. They will have a personal relationship with Jesus as their Savior and Lord, right? So that's our goal, right? It's not just about having a lot of kids, although it's a good thing to have many kids, isn't it? I mean, we want to reach as many kids as possible. That's a good thing. But that's not our goal, right? It's not about having a lot of fun, although it's really good to have fun. I think someone was asking, am I saying that Sunday school must be boring? No, that's not what I mean. Sunday school should be fun, definitely should be fun. But that's not the measure of success, right? We want them to know who Jesus is. That's our goal, right? And it's not just about having well-behaved children, although that's important too, isn't it? Because that helps them to learn, right? But our goal is bigger than that. We want them to understand who Jesus is and put their faith in Jesus. Yeah. So that's what we looked at last week. So let's think about how do you write a lesson. I'm going to skip over this other stuff. You can ask about it later if you want. Okay. So how do you prepare a gospel-centered lesson? Well, here's a few principles before you start. Okay. Number one, teach the gospel rather than morality. That's really a reminder of what I just said. Second point, each lesson has one main point. One main point, right? Not two main points, not three main points, not zero main points. 1 point and only one main point. How many main points should our lesson have? One main point, right? And you repeat that main point as many times as possible in as many ways as possible, right? If you can repeat it many times, it's very likely they will be able to remember it. It's a bit like when you listen to preaching. All of us will go to church tomorrow, we'll listen to a sermon. And now, if the preacher doesn't have a clear main point, right, they might talk for very long, but the next week we might not understand or might not remember what they said. I wonder how many of us can remember what the sermon was about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, or maybe even last week. I don't know. If there was a very clear main point, then maybe you can still remember it. Otherwise, probably quite hard. Right? Now, that's the same with children as well. Right? One main point, we repeat it. Now, what is the main point of my lesson? The main point of my lesson is the main point of the Bible passage that I'm studying that week. The main point is the main point of the Bible passage that I'm studying. Now, let me explain this a bit more. Sometimes what we do when we teach Sunday school is usually we will follow some kind of curriculum, right? We will have some kind of resource or book that we are using to help us to teach the children, isn't it? Now, sometimes if we, I don't know, maybe we become a little bit lazy, or we're a bit unsure of ourselves of what to do. Sometimes what we do is we will just pick up the book and then we will say whatever the book says, right? Or am I the only one who's ever done that? Right? Now, usually when you pick up your book, right, your resource, somewhere at the top, it will say, this is the name of this lesson. This is the main point of this lesson. Yeah. And then usually it will also say, what's the Bible passage that they're getting this main point from as well. Now, that's good. That's helpful, isn't it? But we always need to check that what they say is the main point is actually what the Bible passage is actually saying, isn't it? Right? We don't want to just follow blindly, right? Hopefully our material is a good material, right? And so the explanation, the activity will be very helpful for us. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not as helpful as it could be. And one of the ways you can see this is, remember last week I was saying that it's very important that whenever we are teaching any part of the Bible, we show how it connects to Jesus, right? There's a lot of Sunday school material out there that's not very good at doing that. So often the material will just tell the story, or they'll just say, you should do this or you should do that, but they don't show how it connects to Jesus, right? And so if you just pick it up and you follow it without thinking, then yes, of course, it will help you a little bit. but it may not be as helpful as you hope it will be. Right? So what we should always do, the first thing we do, we look at whatever resource we're doing. It tells you what the Bible passage is, right? Maybe the Bible passage is, I don't know, Mark chapter 1 or something like that. Or maybe the Bible passage is about, I don't know, Daniel 6, Daniel in the lion's den, or something like that. So you open it up, you read, what's the passage that we are looking at today? Okay? And then before you read on with all the rest of the material, you open your Bible, right? You go to the Bible, you read the passage, and you think, what is this passage about, right? And our goal will be to work out what is the main point of that passage. What is God saying to us in that passage? And that will be the main point of my lesson. Now, hopefully, my Sunday school material will say the same thing, but sometimes it won't, right? So that's why I always check first. I always read through the passage and work out, what is this passage all about? What's the main point of this passage? Okay? So each lesson has one main point, only one main point, and that main point is the main point of the Bible passage that I'm looking at that day, right? And then everything that I do in my lesson is related to teaching that main point, right? So if I'm going to play a game at the start of my lesson, then I choose a game that will help the children understand that passage, that main point, right? Or if I'm doing an activity sheet, then I will choose an activity sheet that will help them understand that main point, right? Or if I'm going to play a video, I play a video that will help them to understand that main point. Or I do a memory verse, maybe I do a memory verse that will help them to understand that main point. You see what I'm saying? Everything in the lesson is related to teaching that one main point. And so you play the game, and then you say, wow, we played this game just now. This game is related to what we're learning today. Because in our passage today, we're going to see this. And that's just like what we saw in our game. Okay? Or we're doing an activity sheet now, and there's some questions here, and they're going to remind us, those questions in the activity sheet are going to remind us of this main point that we learned in the lesson today. Okay? Or we're going to sing some songs now, right? And the first song we're going to sing is about this, because we're going to learn about that in our lesson today, right? Do you see what I'm doing? Whatever I'm doing, whichever activity I'm doing in the lesson, I'm always thinking, how am I going to relate it to that one main point in my lesson that's about that Bible passage? Do you see? Now, that main point will always be linked in some way to the gospel. That main point will be always linked in some way to the gospel. Now, maybe we can do an example at this point, can help us, right? Let's think about the David and Goliath, since we did it last week, and let's try and think, okay, if I was writing a lesson plan about David and Goliath, what might my main point be, right? So you remember how we drew that diagram, and we had on one side we had Israel, the other side we had the Philistines, then we had Goliath, right? Scary Goliath, and we had David over here, right? Okay, David's a bit fat today. Never mind. All right, there we go. Now, and then we asked the question, who is like Jesus in this story? Who is the picture of Jesus in this story, right? And we saw that actually, you remind me, who is like Jesus in this particular story? Is it Israel over here? Israel? Is it David? Is it Goliath? Or is it the Philistines? Which of these is like Jesus in the story?
David.
Oh, very good. Correct. Excellent. Right? So because David, in the previous chapter, he's anointed as the king, right? So David was like Jesus, right? And who were we like in the story? Do you remember? So we saw this is like Jesus. Okay. And we were like?
The Israelites.
Correct. God's people, Israel. Correct. And so this is us. All right. So what we see in this story is Israel is helpless to defeat Goliath or the Philistines, right? They're afraid, they're scared, they're trusting in King Saul over here, who's fighting for them, right? And they need God's king to come and rescue them from their enemies. Right? So what might be our main point for this lesson? Maybe it could be something like this. I'll just write it down in the bottom here. God's weak king defeats God's enemies. Is that the best way of putting it? I mean, David, the point is David is small, isn't it? I mean, they're all thinking David's just a boy. He can't beat Goliath. He's got no armor. He's got no sword. All he's got is his sling and a few stones in it. He looks like a rather unlikely victor in this battle, right? But he is the one who defeats God's enemies. Now, notice what I've done here with this main point. How many words is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, a good main point must be short, right? When you're working with a Sunday school, your main point must be 7 words or less. 7 words or less. If it's longer than that, they won't be able to remember it. Now, also, the 7 words, no punctuation, right? No commas, no semicolon, colon, none of that too complicated, right? Just one short statement, 7 words or less. Now, if the children are young, less than 5 years old, then you've got 5 words. 5 words or less, that's your main point. Anything longer than that, it's too hard. It's too complicated. They won't remember it, right? So, if I was doing this with adults, then I might make it a little bit longer, right? I might say, God's weak king defeats God's enemies by trusting God, because that's how he overcomes, isn't it? He says, the battle is the Lord's. God will give him into my hand. He has this amazing faith in God, isn't it? That God will give Goliath into his hands. He might be weak, but God is strong, and he trusts God to win the battle, right? So if I was doing this with adults, I might say God's weak king defeats God's enemies by trusting God, right? I think that's 9 words, right? But with the kids, that might still be a little bit too hard, too complicated. Right? So say that was my main point. You can probably think of a better main point for this. I mean, if you really study that passage, you think about it, I'm sure all of you can come up with a better summary of it than me, right? Now, what I was saying just now is our main point should be related in some way to the gospel, right? I was saying the main point is always linked to the gospel. So how is this main point linked to the gospel? Let's think. God's weak king defeats God's enemies. Now we could change this slightly and we'll make it work, isn't it? Let's see if we can make this something slightly better that uses Jesus in it. Right? Maybe we could say Jesus king who, maybe that's even better, right? Jesus is God's king who saves us. Or, yeah, maybe that's good enough. How many words is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, that's okay. That would be quite memorable. Now that's maybe that's a little bit too generic. I mean, probably there are many passages like that, right? But you can see what I'm trying to do, right? If you want to make it more like this one, you could say that Jesus defeats our enemies by trusting God. Jesus there's not necessarily like one way to do this, but you can see there is what you're trying to do is capture the main point of the passage in a really simple way that points forward to Jesus, right? So what's the original passage about? Well, David, God's king, defeats God's enemies. Okay, but we know that David is like Jesus. He's pointing forward to Jesus. He's foreshadowing Jesus. So when we come to do our application towards the end of the lesson, we'll say, well, you know how David, he was God's king who defeated God's enemies, right? You know what? Well, ultimately, that was a bit like Jesus, because Jesus is our king who defeats our enemies for us. Jesus is our king who defeats our enemies for us. Maybe that's even better, right? Jesus is our king who defeats our enemies for us. Now, I'm thinking out loud here. I'm just trying to show you how you might go about doing this. And when you do it in this way, right, your lesson will be very clear and very focused, right? Because you can say that all throughout the lesson, right? So you start off the lesson. Today, we're going to see how God's king defeats God's enemies, right? And so we're going to play a game, and our first game today is going to be about the king. Is going to be called The King Wins. And you think of some game where one child is the king and they have to do something and then they win, right? And then you sing a song. Well, today's song is all about King Jesus, right? And how he wins the battle for us. And okay, let's do the activity sheet. And here we're reminded that Jesus is, you write on the activity sheet, Jesus is God's king who defeats our enemies. And when you've done that throughout the lesson, right, when the children walk out the door and their parents pick them up, parents always ask the same question, isn't it? After class. What did you learn in Sunday school today? Right? And most kids at that point will just say, I don't know, I don't remember, I forgot. Right? But hopefully, if we've done a good job of having a clear main point and repeating it many times, then they will say, Jesus is God's king who defeats our enemies. Oh, wow. And if not, then you've sent them home with an activity sheet or something, or a craft. And guess what's written on the craft? Jesus is God's king who defeats our enemies. 1 Samuel 17. So even if the child says, I don't know what I learned today, then the parent can pull out the sheet of paper or the craft. Oh, did you learn about King Jesus defeating our enemies? I say, oh yeah, we learned about that. Okay, so that's kind of the approach of how you prepare a lesson. Now, once you've got the main point, you apply the main point both to your own life and to the children, right? So it's always good as a teacher to share what this means for you. Yeah. So in this case, well, I don't know, what does it mean to you that Jesus has been God's King who rescues you? Maybe that you used to not be following King Jesus, and then you realize that another religion or another person, that you couldn't get to heaven by yourself. You couldn't overcome sin. You couldn't overcome death. Only Jesus could do that. And then you put your trust in Jesus as the King. You can share something personal application or story. And then you can help the children to think about how to respond to it as well. What does it mean for Jesus to be their King? What does it mean for him to rescue them from their enemies? And often I think with these kind of application, which maybe in Sunday school we tend to be not very good at doing application. I think sometimes we think, okay, we just tell the story is enough. Right? Or our application is something about, be like David, have a lot of faith, some moral thing to be a good person. But we're not always very good at helping children to think about what the gospel means in their life. I think maybe a good way is often in having some kind of small group discussion, right? Especially if they're a little bit older, if they're, say, 7 years old or above, right? And you can, if you have enough leaders, maybe you can get them into some small groups of 3 or 4, and you can talk with them about what does this passage mean for them. You can help them to know how to respond. Now, sometimes we don't always have that many leaders. I understand that. Maybe you've only got one leader and then they've got to teach everyone. What do you do then? Well, when you give them their activity sheet, or when you give them the craft and everyone's doing that, then what you do is you go to the children one by one and you have a conversation with them one by one while they're doing the craft. You check whether they understand and you try and help them to make a response to it. Yeah. Okay, so let's recap, right? Our lesson has one main point. It's the main point of the Bible passage that we're looking at that day. Everything in the lesson is related to that one main point. We make sure our main point is clearly linked to the gospel. We show how it's related to Jesus. We apply the main point to our lives and the children. Okay? And then the success of the lesson is judged really by how well you've been able to communicate that main point and help the children to respond to it. Okay? Now, when you think about it, that actually takes a lot of effort, doesn't it? It's very hard to do that well. So it's going to take some time to prepare a lesson. When do you start preparing your lesson, do you think? Do you start preparing your lesson on Saturday night? No, right? Why not? If you start preparing your lesson on Saturday night, apart from being very stressed, what will you do? Do you think you will do all the things that I just told you? Definitely not. What will you do? You will get your resource book, you will read it, pray, go to bed, and then next day you will do exactly what it says. Right? No thinking, no creativity, not much effort, right? And it might be okay, but it probably won't be great. Right? So when do you start preparing your lesson? Sunday night, right? Sunday night, right? So you teach on Sunday morning. Then after that, you collapse for a while, recover from what you've just been through because it drains so much energy from you, right? And then maybe just before you go to bed that night, you have a look. What's the lesson for about next week? Just read the passage before you go to bed and start thinking about it. Right? And you can look at it a few times more during the week. Right? The more you think about it, the better you're going to end up teaching it. You wouldn't want your pastor, isn't it, on Sunday, Saturday night, thinking, oh, Sunday tomorrow. I wonder what I'm going to preach tomorrow. And I think, oh, what's on the roster? What does the roster say? Oh, Mark chapter 1 is what are the preaching passage tomorrow. Okay, Google Mark 1 sermon, right? Download, print, read it through once, go to bed, get up the next morning, preach the sermon. All right, now, if that's what a pastor was doing, you would find out pretty quickly, and I don't think you will be very happy with them, right? Teaching the Bible well, it takes some effort, right? And children are no less important than teaching adults. Right? Children are God's people too, right? And they're just as precious to God as the adults are. So of course we want to go to as much effort as we can to teach them the best that we can. All right. Any questions you want to ask about any of those things? Now let's think about what makes a good lesson and what makes a bad lesson. Let's start with what makes a bad lesson, okay? A bad lesson is where it's too abstract. It's too abstract. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, children are concrete thinkers, right? So, for example, if you tell a 5-year-old child to ask Jesus into their hearts, what is that child thinking? You go to Sunday school, you teach your class of 5-year-olds. You need to ask Jesus to come into your heart. What are they thinking?
How can a person goes into a real heart that I have?
Right, exactly. So they're thinking, I need to go and find Jesus, wherever he is, in heaven, I guess. And then I need to somehow, open up my chest and get him into my heart. Right, they'll take it literally, right? They are concrete thinkers. They can't think in abstract concept like that, right? Let me give another example. You say to a child, you need to love other people. You tell a child you need to love other people. Will they understand what you mean? They won't, right? Because love is an abstract concept, right? You need to show them what it means, right? What does it mean to love other people? Well, maybe love means that you will share your toys with your brother and sister. Or maybe love means when there's a new person at school who doesn't have any friends, you go and talk to them, right? Or love is when you give someone a smile and you say, thank you for being my Sunday school teacher. Or, right, you have to give examples, right? to help them understand what this abstract concept means, right? And for children, in fact, adults are no different to this actually. For children and adults, the best way to make it concrete is to tell a story, right? Or to give an example, right? So for example, you want them to understand that Jesus died for their sins. Of course, they go to Sunday school long enough, they will memorize those words because you say them enough times. But they won't know what it means, right? Until you give an example, right? So maybe there's someone who gets in trouble at school, they've done something wrong, they get called to the school teacher's office, they're really worried about the bad thing that's going to happen to them, but then their friend comes and says, you know what, even though he should be in trouble, why don't you put me in trouble instead of him? Let him go free, right? And so the friend has to write out lines on the whiteboard instead of the person who did the wrong thing. All right. See, you've given a story, you've given an example, then they will understand what it means. So many times we fail in teaching children by making it too abstract, right? We don't give concrete example. Now that's why when you teach Sunday school, why having visual aids and why telling stories and giving examples, why playing a game that's kind of similar to it, that's why those things are all so effective, right? Because they are the best way to teach children, right? So if you ever want to learn this better, then you just watch talk to a preschool teacher or a school teacher. They will be able to tell you all about this, right? So second reason lessons often fail is the point is unclear, right? Or maybe there's no main point. So you explain the passage, you do various activities, but you never really say clearly, this is the main point, and you never repeat it. So it may be a good lesson, but they won't really remember what it was all about, what the main point is. Right? So that's a pity, especially if it was a good lesson. Right? No application, that can be a real failure as well, right? No application. So that's where you just teach the story, but you don't show what it means for their life. That's a real problem. That will be a bad lesson, right? Or you moralize the Bible. So that's where you just say, be a good person. These are the 3 things you should do, right? But you don't ever tell them about Jesus. Right? That's a problem. Or it's boring, right? Because what will happen if the lesson is boring? The children will misbehave, right? They will fight with each other. And then what will they learn? Nothing, right? So you want to teach it in an interesting way that you can engage their attention. Boring doesn't help, yeah. And the worst, of course, is you misteach the Bible. So you have the most, exciting lesson, and it's concrete, it's full of examples, and it's applied to their life, but you're actually teaching them heresy, right? Something that's wrong. That would be a real disaster, right? So above everything else, make sure that you are teaching them what is true to God's word. Right? So that's what a bad lesson is. Bad lesson is all of those things, right? It will be too abstract. It won't have a clear main point. It won't apply it to the kids. It'll moralize the Bible. It will be boring, or it will misteach the Bible. That's a bad lesson. Now, here's what a good lesson is. Right? It's quite a carefully chosen definition, and it's adapted from another lady called Sandy Galea. Maybe I'll show you some of her materials later. A good lesson is where the main point of the Bible passage, notice there, it's the main point of the Bible passage. It is taught in a clear, so it's easy to understand, creative, so it's interesting, it's concrete, So there's examples, right? And it is gospel-centered, means that it's pointing to Jesus. A good lesson is where the main point of a Bible passage is taught in a clear, creative, concrete, and gospel-centered manner that points to Christ and is applied to the child. Right? That's what we're aiming for when we prepare our lesson. It's not easy, actually. It takes time to learn. All right, well, let's think, okay, how do I write a lesson? Now, I think all these things start with P, right? The first thing that you should do is pray, right? Pray, pray, pray. Prayer is very important, isn't it? Because we need God's help if the children are going to respond. So you pray. You pray that God will help you to understand the Bible passage. You pray that God will help you to prepare a good lesson. When you meet with the children before the kids come in, you pray with the other teachers. Lord, help us today to have a good lesson. Help the kids to respond well. Then when the kids come in the room, you pray again at the start of the lesson. Right? During the lesson, you pray with them. Right? You pray with the children. After the kids go home, you pray again. Right? You pray, 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 because it's God's work. We need God's help. If we just depend on ourselves, how much will we achieve? Right? So we pray first, and then the next thing we do is we prepare. Now, it's always helpful to know what the children are like that you are teaching. And there's a little, there's the very last page, I think one of the appendixes, there's a table here about understanding age differences. I think this is really helpful. So it shows how children develop at different points, right? So 2 to 5, you know, that age group, right? They're always like, they can't quite walk properly. They're always a bit clumsy. They always drop things. They love having the same thing over and over again. So if you have, you know, like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old child, then, and you're in the car with them, they want the same song to be played over and over again. They want to read the same book over and over again, watch the same TV show over and over again. That's just what they're like, right? Their social environment, it's mainly about themselves, right? They're always thinking of themselves, if not their family. So they don't really bother with having friends, right? If you see a group of 4-year-olds playing together, they don't actually play together, right? One child has their own toys, the other child has their own toys. They play by themselves, except when they want to steal the toys that the other child has got. That's the only time that they interact, and then they fight with each other. That's what young children are like, right? They're very curious. They always ask why. They love to talk. They're starting to learn that there are boundaries. There's right and wrong. God's very much like mummy and daddy. They love stories about Jesus. They're very receptive. They'll basically listen to anything that you tell them, right? Then they get a bit older. Okay, then at 5 to 7, they're starting to learn to read and write, right? They're starting to do things by themselves. School is new, but it's also scary, right? They have an excellent memory, but they hate being pushed out of their comfort zone to something they don't like. They want to have their own way, but they will negotiate a little bit with you. Okay? And they're starting to ask some questions, like interesting questions. Who made God? Will my dog go to heaven? Right, 7 to 11, now they're starting to be better coordinated. They love running around. They love games. There's usually the boy versus girl thing starts to set in at this point. So having games where the boys versus the girls is often good at that age group. They don't like just being spoon-fed at this point. Now they need to start thinking for themselves. They like activities where they can investigate for themselves. They like being able to work it out, work as a team to work it out. Right? And yeah, they're starting to go a lot deeper into the Bible's teaching. And then, of course, 11 to 14, they're almost out of Sunday school, beginning of youth group, and the hormones are setting in, and as the mood swings, and attraction to the opposite sex, and their intellect is a lot stronger, and they can reason really quite well. They begin to question their faith and think, "Oh, am I going to follow this for myself, or is this just my parents' faith?" All that will start to set in. So children develop in all of those ways. If you've had your own children, then I'm sure you will have noticed that. I should also say, of course, that boys and girls are very different. Now, when you teach a class, which is usually the ones that misbehave the most in your experience? Of course, it's the boys, right? Now, usually we want to blame the boys at that point. Say just boys are naughty, right? But I think it can be different to that. Actually, boys and girls are very different in their learning styles, right? Boys develop faster in their physical and slower in their intellectual. Girls are the opposite, right? Girls are slower in their physical, faster in their intellectual. That's why they speak faster and all of that. Now, the thing is, most Sunday school teachers are women, which is wonderful that the women are very committed, right? I think there's a couple of men here. Well done to you. Very important job, right? So that means that most Sunday school teachers are women. Most Sunday school material is written by women. And we tend to write lessons that are like the way that we think, right? So if, for example, we will try to write lessons that appeal more to thinking, intellect, activity sheets, memory verse. All those activities suit girls over boys, right? The boys always like the games, right? Because they like running, right? And they learn best when they're doing things like craft or other activities, right? And so often the reason why the boys misbehave is because we are not engaging them well, right? We are teaching them in the wrong way, right? And so they get bored, and therefore when they get bored, they misbehave, right? So that's helpful to remember. It's always helpful to know how do they tick, and how do they change according to age? How do they change according to their gender? Yeah, and that's something, I guess, if you're a new teacher, it's just going to take some time to learn that. I mean, you could read that table, that will help you a little bit, but these things can take a bit of time to learn. Okay, so that's the first thing. We want to try and understand there. Who are the children in my class? Now, of course, if you have a lot of different types of, like different ages, then of course it's going to be very challenging. You can ask me more about how to approach that later. Okay, then what else do we do, right? Read the passage. Read the passage and get familiar with it. Just read, think, okay, what is this passage about? What questions do I have? What do I not understand? Is there anything repeated here? What do I find interesting? Read the passage. Read it again. Read it again. Read it again. Right? Whatever questions you have is probably the same questions the kids will have, right? Then I try and understand the passage. Right? How do I understand the passage? Well, I want to try and think, well, what does the passage say? That's the content. And how is it related to what happens before it or after it? That's what we call the context. Now, there's a lot of other questions here that will help you to think that through, but let's just give an example with David and Goliath. Right? So to understand the content, I read through the passage. I'm thinking, are there repeated words here? Or are there things that the narrator says that help me to understand what this story is about? What's the main point? But I also think about the context. So I read what happened before it. So I look, what happened the chapter before David beats Goliath? Well, in the chapter before, that's when David is anointed as the king of Israel by Samuel. Right? And that's really important to understand that. So we know that David's not just some random young boy when he's fighting against Goliath. He is God's anointed king. And that's a very important piece of information, because that helps us to see how David is pointing forward to Jesus. Just like David is God's king who defeats the enemies, Jesus is God's king who defeats the enemies. So that little piece of context, just looking at what happened before it, is really helpful and important. So how much you're able to read what happened before or after will depend on how much time you have. Generally, it's very helpful if you can work through things systematically, because then the children will also remember what happened in the previous week. You also will remember. Right? How do I work out what the passage is about? I can ask who, what, when, where, why. I can think about, what is the flow of this passage? Is there different scenes? Is there does it have some kind of structure to it? What's the main section? If I was going to divide this story into 3 sections, what would the 3 sections be? How are they related to each other? Those kind of things can be just helpful to understand. But what I'm working towards in my study of the passage and reading the context is to come up with my big idea, my main point, which I then put in one short, simple sentence for the children. And then I think, how is this applied to the children, right? Okay, so there's also that, here's some different tools I guess you could use that could help you to know how to understand the passage. And I think this today's training is not so much about how do you read a Bible passage. Maybe you need to do another training about that, but hopefully this will at least give you some pointers. So you have prayed, you have prepared. Okay. Now, in your preparation, I like to divide it into 2 aspects, right? Now, if you're a Sunday school teacher, then when you read the passage, if you're anything like me, the first thing you think of is, how am I going to teach this, right? In other words, you think of the creative aspect of it, right? So you're thinking, David and Goliath, we could do a drama about this. That would be so much fun. And one person can be David and one person could be Goliath. And maybe he could get we could, scrunch up a newspaper and they could throw it and try and hit his head. Actually, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe they'll have a big fight. Okay, or maybe what we could do is we could get cardboard boxes and we could use them to make a giant Goliath, which we stick to the wall, and then we put a line, and then they throw target practice at his head, and it's boys versus girls, and whoever can hit his head the most times is the winner, right? Or you think, there was a great video I watched about David and Goliath, or I saw this activity sheet somewhere, or you know what I mean? We are, as Sunday school teachers, we just love this creative aspect of it, right? And so sometimes we so focus on the creative that we forget about the content of the passage, right? Of actually thinking, what is this passage about? What does this passage mean? So when I'm preparing a lesson, I like to kind of divide it like this. And okay, if I have any of those, those good ideas like, giant Goliath, target practice, right? Awesome video, right? Just jot them down the side here because I don't want to lose those ideas, right? But before I get too carried away with starting to make all the props and all of that, I discipline myself a bit. Okay, now let's come back to the Bible passage. What is this passage about? Because otherwise I can have a really fun and creative lesson, but I might not teach it correctly, right? I might not have a very good main point. Do you see what I mean? Okay. So that's why I like to divide it into those 2 parts, right? Okay, so we go back. So we think about the so we've done pray, we've done prepare, we've understood the passage, right? Maybe we've got a few creative ideas. Then we think about packaging, right? How am I actually going to teach it? How am I actually going to bring this across to the kids? Now, a normal lesson will usually have these 3 parts to it, okay? Introduction, introductory activities, the lesson itself, and then follow-up activities. it's a little bit like writing an essay, I guess. I mean, you know, when you're in university, you write an essay. Maybe that's been some time ago. I don't know. But, you know, when you write an essay, you write an introduction, you write a body, and then you have a conclusion at the end, right? And usually they say, right, the introduction, say what you are going to say. The body, say it. The conclusion, tell them what you said, right? A good Sunday school lesson is like that, right? Introduce it. What are you going to look at today? Do some activity to introduce the lesson. Then do the lesson itself, right? Where you are teaching them that Bible passage and what does it mean and how does it apply? And then you have follow-up activities to reinforce that main point that you got from the lesson. So, okay, so your introductory activities, here you're trying to introduce the main point of the lesson. Now, you want to start your lesson in an interesting way, right? It doesn't really matter what it is, so long as it's engaging, yeah? You don't want to start your lesson by this question. Can anyone tell me, what did we learn last week? You know, usually people will decide within the first 20 to 30 seconds of listening to something whether or not it's going to be interesting and whether or not they're going to pay attention, right? So how you start the lesson is very important, right? There are many ways of starting the lesson. So you could ask them a question that maybe they haven't thought about, tell them a story, play a game, show them a visual aid. I mean, one of the favorites would be, you know, you bring some bag. Can anyone guess what's in the bag here? Or do some kind of group activity. It doesn't really matter what it is, so long as it's interesting, it arouses some attention. But remember, whatever you do to start off the lesson, it should be related to what you're going to be learning that day, because otherwise you're just wasting time in the lesson, right? Yeah. Now you can also do revision here as you start the lesson, but revision doesn't have to be boring, right? Revision doesn't have to be, so yeah, what did we learn last week? What did David do? You know, who anointed David as king? I mean, that kind of cute, you ask a question, they give an answer. Okay, it's a revision, but it's not very interesting, is it? Right? Can you make it a game, right? I mean, can you make a giant dice, right? Usually in kids ministry, the bigger anything is, the better, right? So you make a giant dice, you put them on two teams, right? If they get the question correct, then they can roll the dice. And, you know, if they get a 1, they get 1 point. If they get a 2, they get 2 points. If they get 3, then it's 0 points. 4, the other team loses a point. 5, it's double points. And 6, then you lose all your points. I don't know. Maybe that's too complicated, right? But it's suddenly so exciting then, isn't it? It's a competition. It's a game. Everyone wants to answer. Everyone wants to try and get it correct, you see. Or, I don't know, you have, you put a poster up on the wall, and every time, and you cover it up like a puzzle, right? And every time they get the correct answer, then they can take one piece off the puzzle, and they've got to try and guess what is underneath. And maybe it's a picture or it's a word that's related to your lesson to that day, right? So there are so many interesting and creative ways to teach, even to do revision. It doesn't have to be, what did we learn last week? Who can tell me who anointed David? Okay, I mean, it's always better if it can be more engaging than that. Yeah. So be creative, enjoy it, and the kids will also have fun. And when they're having fun, they'll also be better behaved. Yeah. So that's revision, that's introduction. You don't want to spend too much time on that. You want to spend most of your time doing the actual lesson itself. And of course, whatever material you're using will give you many ideas, many other ideas here. Yeah? Okay, then you're doing the lesson itself, right? And here you're doing a combination of different things. Essentially, what you want them to do is listen to the story for that day, right? And you teach what it means and help them to think about its relevance for their life, right? Now they're different things. Now you want to make sure at least that you read the Bible at some point in the lesson. Now, if they are kids, like 3 years old or something, there's probably not much point in reading from the Bible directly, unless it's a very simple kids Bible, right? But at least you want them to know it's from the Bible, right? So you say today's Bible story is from the book of Genesis. Do you know Genesis? It's the first book in the Bible. You see, it's Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Let me tell you what it's all about, right? On the first day of creation, God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. Here's a picture of the light, right? So at least they know that it's coming from the Bible, even if you're not reading from it directly. But as they get older, you want them to engage with the Bible more and more. So, you know, when they're three, maybe they're 5, 6 years old, you can get them to read 1 or 2 verses that are maybe important, and you might teach the rest of the lesson in another way. 7 to 9, maybe they can read through the whole passage already. 10 to 12, maybe they can do a short Bible study already, right? So more Bible as you go. But when I say that, it doesn't mean that you only just read the Bible. That's it. You can't do anything else fun. No. Sure, you show a video, do a drama, do whatever way that you want to help to teach the lesson. Just make sure that the Bible is there, right? And that they can engage directly with the Bible in some way that's appropriate to their age. Yeah? Now, it can be really helpful, I think, to have some kids' Bibles. Different kids' Bibles can be really helpful at this point. I brought along a couple of Bibles from my kids' shelf just so I can show you. There's so many good ones out there these days. I don't know how many of these that you have seen. Right? Now, if you have very young children, right, then this is probably the best Bible that I know for young kids. It's called the Beginner's Bible. Right? It's really good. It's got great pictures. There's King Herod, very angry. Right? You can see how many words. It's very short. Each page, just 1 or 2 lines. Picture with a few lines. And then one story might be only just 3 or 4 pages. That story's over already. Right? So it's very short, good pictures, but this very simple text. Very faithful to the Bible. So for young kids, that's really good. If you want to know how do I do this in a simple way, it's a great Bible. Other ones, this is quite a nice one, Gospel Story Bible. One of the good things about this is it is showing you how does that Bible passage connect with Jesus. Again, it's got some really nice pictures, and tells you the gospel as you go through. Really nice Bible, right? Jesus Storybook Bible, very nice. Every story whispers his name, right? So for every story in this Bible, and there's lots of them, it always shows how is it related to Jesus. It can be a really great help to know how do I connect this to Jesus in a simple way. Now, okay, if you like boys, if you have boys, the Action Storybook Bible, okay? It's cartoon form, comic form. Very good for boys. Sometimes boys is hard to engage, right? Really good for the boys, right? It actually follows the Bible text very closely, but comic pictures. This is the one I'm reading with my daughter at the moment, the Gospel Story Bible, Marty Mikowski. My daughter's 5, by the way, but this is really good for her, and it's got these 3 questions on the side. And of course, if you're looking for the BM Bible, I'm sure you've seen this before, right? The Alkitab Kanak-Kanak is very good, and they also have some other cartoon versions as well, different things. So There are a lot of good Bibles out there, but sometimes having something like those will help. Now, I'm sure you didn't get a chance to write down all the names of those books. So where do you get them from, right? Okay, let me show you. So the website equip.org.my. And then if you go across here to resources, children's ministry. Do you see that? Click that. And there's a PDF you can download. It's got everything here. Recommended resources for children's ministry. Children's books. Family devotions. There's some pictures of some of the books. Bible story books. So most of the ones I just showed you are listed here. And Bibles for different age groups. Other ministry resources like Sunday school materials, Bible tracts, parenting, websites, DVDs, music, right? All there, right? It's a really good summary of a lot of the children's ministry resources that's out there. Now, say you're looking for good Sunday school materials. What are some good materials that is out there? Again, there's a lot of really good materials out there. Many of them are listed in that document I just showed you. Let me just show you a couple of them. One of them is called the Gospel Project. Remember we watched a video last week? That video comes from this group called the Gospel Project. So they have really good materials here, and it's all digital materials. So it's a 3-year plan. Every lesson comes with video and music to go with it. A lot of activity sheets. Every lesson shows how it points forward to Jesus. It's really, really good. It's fantastic, actually. The only thing about it is it's a bit expensive because it's in USD. So by the time you convert, it can be a little bit pricey, but it's very, very, very good material. Now, if you want something that is much cheaper, but also very good, you can try this one called Mustard Seeds. Just type in Mustard Seeds Sunday School, you'll find it. Mustard Seeds, yeah. mustardseeds.net, right? This material, it costs, you just get a subscription, and the subscription is really, really cheap, very cheap. I think one whole year subscription for our church was something like 250 ringgit or something like that. Because you can get a discount from this. If you are Malaysian, you can get a discount. If you ever want to use this, you let me know. I'll tell you what the discount code is for this, 50% discount for Malaysians. And there's just so much materials here. So I'll just click here, materials. Over 40 different series. Each series, maybe 10 lessons for each one. Toddlers, 3 to 11s. Yeah, it's just really, really, really excellent. You can see how many lesson plans is there. It's just so much, and very, very good quality. And some of them are translated into different languages, including Indonesian, Chinese, other things. So that can be very helpful too, including the graphics and all of that. Yeah, so maybe those are two that you could check out if you're wondering where to start. Yeah, sorry, just show you one more. One more is from a lady called Sandy Galea, and her website is called Kids Wise. Kids Wise. Again, there's just loads of really good resources here. Some of them are free, but she's got a full curriculum, and she's written Bible stories for kids on. I think there's about 1,000 of them on this website. So once you got the subscription, you can access all the resources. So really, really good. Okay, I think that's enough resource recommendation. Right? But I'm just saying there's a lot of good stuff out there. So just having a good resource often can help you in your lesson planning. Okay? So it doesn't have to be boring. You can teach in all kinds of creative ways, and often a good material that is gospel-centered will help you to do that. Okay, then you do your follow-up activities, right? And here you're trying to reinforce the main point of the lesson for that day. So you might sing songs, do a craft, have discussion groups, do activity sheets, pray together, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, right? And the point is just to try and teach them the same thing again and again and again from, 10 different angles, right? So that by the time they leave the room that day, they're very clear what the lesson is about. And now, but with the follow-up activities, we're especially having some focus on, I guess, how to apply it to them, how to help the children to respond to the lesson. So that's why it has things like discussion, praying, songs, even activity sheets, where you can get them to think a little bit more about what does this mean for me. So those are the 3 parts. Introduce something interesting to start off. The lesson itself, make sure you read the Bible, but also teach it in an interesting way. Then the follow-up activities where you're reinforcing the message, but also trying to help them to think, what does this mean for my life? Now, the best way to prepare a lesson is that you do all of that by yourself first, right? So before you read through the materials, first you just read, what's the passage for today, right? I look it up in the Bible. I try and work out what the main point of it is. I think, how would I teach this lesson? What would be my introduction? What would be my lesson? What would be my follow-up activities? I try and prepare as much as I can first. And then I look at the material that I have. Now, the reason for that is, if you look at the material first, 2 things will happen. The first one is, you will kill your own creativity, right? Because the only game, the only lesson, the only skit you'll be able to think of is the one that you read in the notes. But it was probably written by someone in America or in the UK who's not Malaysian, who doesn't live in Sarawak, right? It might not be the best way to do it, right? You know the kids, you know where you live, you can probably come up with something better, right? So you do your own one first. The other problem is, of course, if you just go straight to the material, then you're not engaging with the Bible yourself. And you are not able to check, is this lesson plan correct or not, right? You will just follow it blindly. Okay? So you do your own work first, and then you read the lesson plan, and then you can think, oh, okay, I had planned to do this activity. They've suggested that activity. I think mine's better, I'll do mine. Or you think, oh, actually, mine's pretty lousy. I didn't really come up with anything for that. I'll just do what they suggested. Right? Or the lesson, they're saying that I should maybe do this skit. Well, I guess the skit could work. Maybe we could do the skit and we could also watch this video that I found. Okay, good. And then you do you come down to doing the follow-up activities. And they say, oh, here's this craft that you can do. Think, okay, that's a good craft. But I also thought maybe we could do this activity sheet together, right, which I've prepared. Right? So your lesson will be better because you've been able to think about it for yourself first. Now, I guess sometimes if we're starting out, we're not very confident. Okay, of course, we can follow the materials more closely because we're just learning, right? But as we become more experienced, I guess we will be more familiar with the different resources out there that might be helpful for us to use. Okay. Now, so we've had our piece: pray, prepare, package. Then the next one is practice, right? You want to be very well prepared for your lesson. The worst part is, right, you've prepared this wonderful lesson, you put a lot of effort, you've got a great lesson plan, and then this is what you do in your class. So kids, the first thing we're going to do today is this. We're going to play this, and then, oh, we're going to read this, and then after that. So you're just reading your notes, no eye contact, no engagement. The lesson's going to be a failure. Or you're thinking, now we're going to watch this video now. And then you're playing on the computer. Oh no, where is the video again? I can't find it. Or the sound's not working. Or yeah, or we're going to play this game. Actually, I needed to get some prop. Where is my bag? I left it in my bag. Oh, I left it at home. All right. All that kind of thing means all your good effort will be wasted, you know. So some effort to practice beforehand will make a big difference, right? And the last one, I've never worked out how to make this start with P, right? Is feedback, right? If I was being cheeky, I could spell it like this, right? Right? But yeah, feedback. The best way to learn is to improve as a teacher is to get feedback from other teachers. Now, I know what it's like. After you've just put in all this effort to prepare a lesson, the last thing you want is to get feedback from another teacher and they say, actually, that part of the lesson wasn't very good. This part could be better. Why don't you try this next time? You'll feel so heartbroken. You'll feel so discouraged. Like, I tried so hard and you think it's still not a good lesson. I know. I've been through that many times, right? But the thing is, unless you can get feedback from other people, this was good, this can be improved, you'll never get better, you see, right? Now, I think as Malaysians, we are not very good at getting feedback. You ask, oh, how was my lesson today? Oh, very good. Everything very good. Right? Because we don't want them to lose face. We don't want them to be discouraged. So we just say everything's fine. They'll never get better.
Is it right?
Right? So if we can create a culture where we can, maybe after each lesson, we can just have a short meeting. Like, what went well today? What didn't go well? Pray about it. That culture can be really good and can
culture
to improve as teachers. So maybe you can consider that in the future. Okay, I think we're basically out of time. So let me just tell you what else is in the notes here, and then you can go and read it later. So the part we skipped over is thinking about a bit about church and how that is related to how we think about children's ministry. All these questions here, verses, the answers are in the back, right? There's an appendix at the back of the notes. Appendix 1. It has all the answers there, all right? Just a tip. So there's that part about church. Then there's a whole part about what are our aims as teachers, right? And a whole lot of things, a whole lot of ideas here, right? Of how you can achieve those aims. It might be worth, as a Sunday school team, you read through that, you think about it, you discuss it together. It might give you some ideas of things you can do, right? So there's a lot of things there. Then we have the lesson plan, which is what we did tonight, right? And after that, there's a section on evaluating the lesson, right? And some activities there. Now, in the appendix, there's some sample lessons, right? These are lessons that I wrote, okay? Now, they are not my best lessons. Just warn you, right? Don't think, oh, this is a model lesson. No, I deliberately pick some of my lesson that is not so good. Something's good, something's not so good, so that you can look at it and evaluate it and think, oh, okay, this is how it can be improved. So I just explained that. Don't think that that is a model lesson. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be a lesson that has some problems in it, right? So some good things, some problems. So you can look at it and think, how can it be improved? But you'll see how it talks about some of the things we've looked at. There are some suggestions on classroom management and how do you do discipline well. It's very brief. If you want to ever do more training on that, we can do that, right? And then there's some recommended resources here. This is not the full list, right? The full list is on the website I showed you, right? But there is still, there's some of the resources is listed there. So what have we seen? What we want to do is teach children the gospel, right? In any part of the Bible we're looking, how is this related to who Jesus is and what Jesus has done? How do we prepare a lesson? One main point. It's the main point of the Bible passage. Everything in the lesson is related to that one main point. We don't want a lesson that's too abstract, too boring, no application. No, we want a lesson that is clear, creative, concrete, points them to Jesus, applies the passage, right? And as we structure it, how do we prepare? Pray, prepare, package, practice, and then get feedback. And as you package it, 3 sections. Introduction, where you get their attention. The lesson, where you teach the passage. And then follow-up activities, where you reinforce it and you apply it to the children. So that's what we've seen today. I hope it's been helpful for you. And I'll finish up there. And do you want to ask any questions, or is there anything that you want to anything else that you want to say?
Yeah, sometimes when we focus on certain passages, okay, and perhaps it's just a few verses of the passage, how then can we put it and relate it to Jesus?
Do you have an example in mind? Sorry?
Maybe sometimes when we come from like the book of Psalms or Proverbs, yeah, so it's like maybe we won't read the whole psalm. Maybe we pick up some passages on wisdom, for example. So some words, on that. So how are we to then relate it, the verses, to relate it to point towards Jesus?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some parts of the Bible will be easier than others. I mean, the Psalms is okay because most of the Psalms is written by King David or King Solomon, and so their circumstances usually is very mirror Jesus a lot. And the apostles quote from the Psalms a lot in the New Testament. So when you're reading the Psalms, you just think, okay, how is what is written in this Psalm like what happened to Jesus, right? And maybe it's even quoted in the New Testament. That can help. If it's Proverbs, and Proverbs can be very challenging. I mean, Proverbs is a bit different, where it's maybe giving you wisdom about friendship, or a good friend will tell you the truth, for example, those kind of things. So you have to think, okay, how is that theme perhaps picked up in the New Testament, maybe by Jesus in his teaching? So say it's the topic of friendship. I think in John 13, Jesus says, I call you friends because I'm showing you what I'm going to do. And there's no greater love than this, that a man lays down his life for his friends. And a passage like that is showing, okay, actually Jesus is the best friend, right? He's the ultimate friend who loves his friends sacrificially, that he will give his life. So there are ways, of course, of connecting to Jesus, even from Proverbs, but it is more difficult. It definitely is. It will depend really on how well maybe is your knowledge of the New Testament, that you're able to know what passages might be relevant there. Yeah.
Thank you. And last question from me. Actually, I never ever taught on the Song of Solomon, because I think the words are a bit, I mean, when you talk to children, I really have no idea how to go about doing it. Yeah, so yeah, that's the tip. I have never ever touched on this book before.
Yeah, a lot of adults haven't either. I have preached on that book though. It was very interesting. I guess when you're teaching children, you don't have to teach them everything in one shot, right? They are going to grow up. They are going to become youth. I'm not saying that you withhold things deliberately from them, but sometimes, yeah, you want to think what's actually the best way to do this. So I guess when you start with the younger kids, say the 3 years, 4 years old, you're really just trying to set the very basic building blocks. Who is God? You know, he's powerful. He knows everything. He loves us. He made the world. Who is Jesus? Okay, Jesus is God's son. He did miracles. He died on the cross. He rose again. He calls us to follow him. Like, you're just trying to introduce the really basic building blocks, really basic concepts. 5 to 6, okay, now we'll go in a little bit more detail on some of those things. Maybe we will spend a bit more time looking at the life of Jesus. Maybe we'll think about the book of Exodus a little bit, a few more stories from the Old Testament. 7 to 9, okay, now we're going to go through in a lot more detail, right? Maybe many stories in the Bible, but maybe not in a lot of detail on them, to give them a good grasp. And then 10 to 12, let's go deep on some of the more important ones. So we don't have to necessarily do everything in one shot. And I would think a book like Song of Solomon, I don't know if I would do that with children. I don't know how helpful that would be. Or if I was going to do it with them, I would think very carefully about how I would frame it. I certainly would spare the details. It certainly is a book about Jesus. I mean, it's a book about the beauty of love and marriage and sex within marriage, which is ultimately pointing forward to Jesus, because we know in Ephesians 5 that the ultimate marriage is between Jesus and the church, right? So as we see something of that celebration of love and marriage in Song of Solomon, and that's a picture of ultimately of Jesus' love for his people, right? I guess you could teach that to children, but you'd have to think very carefully about how you did it, because otherwise it just might not be very helpful. Yeah.